The forest held its breath, waiting. A sliver of moon hung in the ink-black sky, its light too thin, too sharp, casting the clearing in shades of silver and bone. Cold seeped up from the packed earth, a hungry chill that worked its way through the worn wool of my tunic and settled deep in my marrow. Around me the Blackwood pack shifted, a low growl of anticipation rippling through their ranks. I could smell it on them, the acrid tang of fear mixed with the metallic scent of pride. They were predators, ready to bare their teeth for the alpha of alphas. I, however, was only prey. My head was bowed, my hair a tangled curtain hiding my face from the contemptuous stares I could feel burning into me. Humiliation was an old, familiar cloak. I had worn it since my own pack. The silver crests had fallen, leaving me an orphaned Omega, a stray taken in by this brutal assembly, out of some forgotten obligation. I was a ghost at their feast, a shadow in their longhouse, a constant, silent reminder of failure. But tonight was different. Tonight, the whispers had become a storm. Tonight, the alpha of shadows was coming, and even the silence I lived in could not hide from him. A heavy boot stomped on the ground beside me, and I flinched. "On your knees, stray," Alpha Boran of the Blackwood pack snarled. His voice was like rocks grinding together, full of gravel and malice. He didn't need to give the order, I was already kneeling, but the command was for the others, a public display of my worthlessness. The coarse fingers of his beta, Fenris, tangled in my hair and yanked my head back, forcing my gaze upward. The thin moonlight stung my eyes. The circle of shifters surrounding me seemed to press in, their faces a gallery of smirks and disgust. "Lord Kalen Daymar arrives to collect his tribute," Boran announced, his chest puffed out. "He will see that the Blackwood pack is strong, that we have trimmed the fat, that we tolerate no weakness." His eyes, small and cruel, landed on me. I was the fat. I was the weakness. A wolfless Omega, barren and mute, unable to contribute to the pack's strength, unable even to offer the comfort of a warm body without reminding them of my disgraced bloodline. Fenris shoved me forward, and I stumbled, catching myself on palms raw from scrubbing floors and splitting kindling. I landed in the center of the clearing, a sacrifice laid upon an altar of dirt and stone. The pack's laughter was a physical blow, sharp and cruel. My breath hitched, a silent sob trapped in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing the earth would swallow me whole. For years I had perfected the art of being invisible, of moving through rooms like a wisp of smoke, of leaving no trace. But here, under the scrutinizing gaze of the entire pack, I was hideously, agonizingly visible. Then a change. It was not a sound, but the absence of it. The crickets went silent. The wind, which had been whispering through the pines, died completely. The restless shifting and growling of the pack ceased, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the world had stopped turning. Even Boran's boorish confidence seemed to shrink, his shoulders hunching slightly. A collective intake of breath swept through the clearing. He was here. I didn't need to see him to know. The air itself grew heavy, thick with a power so ancient and immense, it felt like the mountain itself had descended upon us. A scent unlike any I had ever known coiled through the clearing, eclipsing the familiar smells of pine and damp earth. It was the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, of cold iron, of ancient forests where the sun never reached, and beneath it all, a deep, aching loneliness that resonated with the hollow place inside my own chest. I risked a glance, peering through the tangled mess of my hair. He emerged not from the path, but from the deepest shadows between two monolithic pines, as if the darkness itself had given birth to him. The legends did not do him justice. Kalen Daymar was not a man. He was a force of nature, taller than any shifter I had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the sky. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with his formidable size. Scars, pale and silver in the moonlight, mapped a history of violence across his throat and down one side of his face, disappearing into the high collar of his dark leather tunic. but it was his eyes that held the true terror. They were the color of a winter storm, a churning, turbulent gray that seemed to see everything and value nothing. They swept over the assembled pack, a brief, dismissive glance that made even the most hardened warriors bow their heads in submission. Alpha Born stepped forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by a fawning deference. "Lord Daymar," he began, his voice strained. "We are honored. Our tribute is prepared." Kalen paid him no mind. His gaze continued its slow, inexorable path across the clearing. He was a king surveying his domain, and we were nothing more than the dirt beneath his boots. I lowered my head again, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't see me. Please just don't see me." To be noticed by him, the cursed Alpha, was to be judged. And to be judged by him was to be found wanting. The legends were clear. His curse was a shadow that devoured all light, and any who grew too close would wither in its chill. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. His sweeping gaze stopped. It froze, locking onto the center of the clearing, onto Mek, the world narrowed to a single terrifying point. The heavy, oppressive power in the air intensified, focusing like a spear tip aimed directly at my heart. I could feel the weight of his stare. As a physical pressure, a brand searing my skin. A low sound rumbled from his chest, not a word, but the deep, primal growl of a predator that has just caught the scent of its destined prey. It vibrated through the ground, up through my bones, and awakened something within me I thought long dead. My wolf. I had no wolf. The shifting fever had never taken me, leaving me fractured, incomplete. Yet now, a faint, dormant ember deep inside me flickered to life. It was a desperate, forgotten thing, and it whimpered in recognition, straining toward the impossible power that was focused on me. Slowly, as if in a trance, I lifted my head. Our eyes met. The universe fractured. The air didn't just burn, it detonated. The scent of ozone and iron became a storm inside my lungs, intoxicating and terrifying. His storm gray eyes widened, the disinterest replaced by a raw, savage shock. I saw the iron walls of his control shudder. I saw the ancient curse he carried flicker in his gaze like black lightning. And I saw his wolf, a magnificent, terrifying beast of shadow and rage, slam itself against the cage of his ribs, fighting for release. He took a step, then another. He moved with a purpose that was terrifying in its intensity, ignoring the sputtering Alpha Boran, bypassing the betas who scrambled to get out of his way. The entire pack held its breath, a forest of statues carved from fear. He walked as if we were all ghosts, as if the only living thing in the entire world was the broken Omega kneeling in the dirt. He stopped just before me, close enough that I could feel the heat rolling off his body. He was a furnace of contained power. I was trembling, not from cold, but from a terrifying, exhilarating current that was arcing between us. He was so large he blocked out the moon, casting me in his personal shadow. He knelt. The great Kalen Daymar, the Alpha of Shadows, the cursed king, knelt in the dirt before me. The motion was fluid, reverent, and it sent a shockwave of disbelief through the clearing. He lowered himself until his stormy eyes were level with mine. The scars on his face were stark, beautiful, and terrible. He lifted a hand, his fingers long and calloused, and I flinched, expecting a blow. I saw a flicker of pain, his own, not mine, cross his face. His hand paused, hovering in the air between us for a heartbeat. Then, with an agonizing slowness, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of matted hair from my cheek. His touch was not cold, as the legends claimed. It was fire, a clean, searing flame that didn't burn, but cauterized every wound I had ever suffered. It was life itself, pouring into the empty vessel of my soul. My breath caught. The ember of my dormant wolf roared into a bonfire, howling in silent ecstasy. His lips parted, and a single word escaped, a raw, guttural sound that was both a prayer and a command. It wasn't spoken to the pack, or to the moon, or to the gods who had cursed him. It was whispered only to me, a sacred, terrible truth that sealed our doom and our salvation in the same breath. Mine. The word hung in the frozen air, a brand of heat and sound against the absolute silence. Mine. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, as elemental and undeniable as the moon hanging overhead. It settled in the marrow of my bones, a resonant chord that vibrated through every broken piece of me. The jeers of the Blackwood pack had died in their throats, their smirks melting into slack-jawed disbelief. Alpha Boren's face was a mask of confusion, rapidly curdling into pure terror. He had offered me up as a symbol of weakness, and the alpha of alphas had just claimed me as a treasure. Kalen Daymar rose to his full, formidable height, a mountain of shadow and leather eclipsing the thin moonlight. His hand, which had touched my cheek with such shocking gentleness, now wrapped around my upper arm. His grip firm, possessive. He pulled me to my feet with an effortless strength that left me dizzy. I stumbled against his side, my frayed tunic a pathetic rag against the hard planes of his body. He immediately shifted his stance, placing me slightly behind him, shielding me from the goggling eyes of the pack. The gesture was so instinctual, so fiercely protective, it stole the breath from my lungs. No one had ever shielded me from anything. The silence finally shattered. Boren, his bravado returning in a foolish, desperate surge, took a half-step forward. "Lord Daymar," he stammered, his voice cracking. "There must be some mistake. This is Arden, the Silvercrest stray. She is nothing. Wolfless, barren, cursed in her own right. She is not fit tribute for—" A growl, low and guttural, ripped from Kalen's chest. It was not the sound a man made. It was the sound of bedrock splitting, of a storm gathering on a desolate peak. It silenced Boren instantly, forcing the rest of his words back down his throat. Kalen didn't even turn to look at him. His storm-gray eyes remained fixed on the path leading back into the darkness, but the sheer force of his displeasure radiated from him like a physical blow. The air grew 10 degrees colder. "You presented your pack for my assessment, Boren," Kalen said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried across the clearing with terrifying clarity. "I have made my assessment." He turned his head then, just enough to pin Boren with a sidelong glance that promised annihilation. "What is mine is not for you to name or to judge." Boren fell to his knees as if his legs had been cut out from under him. "My lord," he whimpered, his face ashen. Fenris and the others followed suit, their heads bowed low to the dirt. They were no longer a pack of predators. They were curs groveling before their master. And I stood at that master's side, trembling. My mind was a whirlwind of chaos. This could not be happening. It was a dream, a feverish delusion brought on by hunger and cold. The man beside me was a legend, a nightmare whispered by mothers to frighten unruly pups. The moon's curse, the iron oath, a heart that could not love, a bond that meant only death for the one he chose. Yet his hand was a searing heat on my arm. His scent, that impossible blend of lightning, iron, and deep, profound solitude, was wrapping around me like a cloak, and the forgotten thing inside me, my ghost of a wolf, was singing a song of homecoming. Without another word, Kalen turned and began to walk, pulling me along with him. He moved back toward the deepest shadows from which he had emerged. As we reached the edge of the clearing, 2 figures detached themselves from the trees. They were Kalen's warriors, his betas, and they moved with the same silent, deadly grace as their alpha. One was a broad-shouldered man with a grim, scarred face, the other a tall, lithe woman with eyes that glittered like obsidian chips. They fell into step behind us, their presence a silent, menacing rearguard. The Blackwood pack remained kneeling in the dirt, too terrified to even watch us leave. We plunged into the true forest. The canopy of ancient pines was so thick that it blotted out the sky completely. Here, there was no moonlight, only an oppressive breathing darkness, but Kalen moved through it with an unnerving confidence, his steps sure and silent on the thick carpet of pine needles. I, on the other hand, stumbled constantly, my bare feet already calloused, found every sharp stone and gnarled root. My thin tunic offered no protection against the grasping branches that tore at my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps, a mixture of exertion and terror. Every instinct I had honed for survival screamed at me to run, to flee this terrifying silent man who was dragging me toward an unknown fate. But the hand on my arm was an anchor, and the burgeoning wolf within me whimpered every time the thought of escape crossed my mind. It wanted this. It wanted him. A sharp root caught my foot, and I pitched forward with a silent cry, my full weight wrenching against his grip. He stopped instantly. The two warriors behind us halted as well, fading back into the shadows. Kalen turned, his expression unreadable in the deep gloom. He looked down at me, then his gaze dropped to my feet, caked in mud and bleeding from a dozen small cuts. A muscle feathered in his jaw, a flash of some powerful, restrained emotion. I thought he would be angry, that he would berate me for my weakness, for slowing him down. It was what I expected. It was all I had ever known. Instead, he released my arm, and before I could process his intent, he bent and swept me up into his arms. The world tilted on its axis. A small, strangled sound escaped my throat, the first sound I had made in years. I was weightless, then suddenly secure, held tight against the unyielding wall of his chest. My cheek was pressed against the cool leather of his tunic, and I could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heart beneath my ear. Thump, 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 thump. It was the most solid, most real thing I had ever felt. The scent of him was overwhelming now, seeping into my senses, dizzying me. Ozone, iron, forest, and that aching loneliness that called to the very core of my soul. I was rigid with shock, my hands hovering awkwardly, afraid to touch him. He adjusted his hold, one arm securely under my legs, the other supporting my back, and began to walk again as if I weighed nothing. His stride was just as silent, just as swift. The intimacy of the act was a cataclysm. I had been touched only with violence and contempt. To be held like this with such care, as if I were something precious, it was unthinkable. It shattered the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart. For the first time in a decade, I felt a tear slide from the corner of my eye, tracing a hot path through the grime on my cheek. I was not being dragged to my doom. I was being carried. The journey seemed to last an eternity, a dreamlike passage through an endless night. I must have drifted off, lulled by the rhythm of his heart and the sheer exhaustion of it all, because I was startled awake when the landscape changed. We emerged from the oppressive forest onto a high, wind-swept ridge, and there, carved into the face of the mountain itself, was his fortress. It was no castle of elegant spires and welcoming torchlight. It was Shadowhold, a brutalist masterpiece of black granite and sharp angles. It seemed to have been clawed from the rock by some great beast. Mist clung to its base, and the only light came from narrow slits high in the walls, like the watching eyes of a predator. It was a place of power and sorrow, a fortress built to keep the world out, and a curse locked within. It was a perfect reflection of the man who now carried me across its threshold. The great doors, made of iron-banded oak, swung open without a sound, and we passed into a cavernous hall. The air inside was cool and smelled of stone, wood smoke, and old secrets. A massive fire roared in a hearth big enough to roast an ox, casting flickering, monstrous shadows across the stone walls. And standing before the fire, waiting, were two figures. An older she-wolf with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a severe braid, stood beside a gnarled man whose face was a road map of ancient battles. Their eyes were fixed on us, and the moment they saw me in their alpha's arms, their expressions turned to ones of utter horror. This was not the welcome of a beta and an advisor. It was the shock of witnesses to a sacrilege. Kalen's steps did not falter. He carried me to the center of the hall and gently set me down on my feet. I swayed, my legs unsteady, and his hand immediately went to the small of my back to steady me. It was a small, proprietary gesture that did not go unnoticed. The older woman stepped forward, her face pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, raked over me with a mixture of pity and fury. "Kaelin," she said, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled rage, "what have you done?" He did not answer her. His gaze was still on me, a churning tempest of emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. "You swore an oath," the woman pressed, her voice rising. "In this very hall, upon the moonstone of your ancestors. You swore it in iron and ash. No Luna, no bond. To break it is to invite the curse upon her. Her life is now forfeit." The word struck me like a physical blow. Her life is now forfeit. The legends weren't just stories, they were truth. The man who had touched me with reverence, who had carried me from my own personal hell, was the very instrument of my death. The bond that was awakening within me, that nascent song of hope, was a funeral dirge. Kaelin's hand tightened on my back. He finally tore his gaze from me to face the old she-wolf, his expression hardening into a mask of granite. But it was too late. I had seen it. In that split second before the mask fell, as he looked from her condemning face to my terrified one, I saw the truth. It wasn't the arrogance of a king or the fury of a warrior. In the storm-gray eyes of the Alpha of Shadows, for the first time, I saw raw, unadulterated fear. And it was all for me. The old she-wolf's words were stones cast into a silent pool, and I was the water, shuddering with the impact. Her life is now forfeit. The fear I'd seen in Kaelin's eyes was not for the consequences he might face, but for the price I would be forced to pay. For the first time in my life, my existence had value to someone, and that value was measured in the finality of my own death. The irony was a bitter acid in my throat. Kaelin's hand at my back was an immovable wall of heat and resolve. "Elara Hald," he said, his voice dropping, losing its thunderous authority and taking on a sharper, more lethal edge. "You forget yourself." "I forget nothing," she retorted, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She was brave, I had to grant her that. To speak to him this way took a will of granite. "I remember the prophecy as it was written. I remember your mother, her life a flickering candle snuffed out by the very bond that should have sustained her. And I remember the oath you swore over her grave. Have you forgotten that, Kaelin? The iron and the ash?" The gnarled warrior, Gregor, finally spoke, his voice a low, rough growl. "Alpha, the council must be convened. The pack is already restless. To bring an unmarked, unbonded stray, an Omega, into the heart of Shadowhold, claiming her as yours. It is a disruption we cannot afford. The prophecy—" "Enough!" Kaelin's voice was not loud, but it cleaved the air, silencing them both as effectively as a blade to the throat. He turned his head slowly, and the firelight carved deep shadows into the harsh planes of his face, making the scars stand out in stark relief. His storm-gray eyes were no longer just turbulent. They were glacial, promising a cold and certain end to any who defied him. My mother's fate was her own. My oath was made to protect this pack from a weakness I would never allow. But I am the Alpha here. What I claim, I keep. She is not a disruption. She is mine. The matter is not open for discussion." He looked down at me then, and the ice in his eyes thawed just enough to let a sliver of warmth through. It was a guarded, painful heat, but it was aimed solely at me. He saw my trembling, the way I was folding in on myself, trying to vanish into the floor. His expression softened with a flicker of an emotion I couldn't name. Regret, perhaps, or a fierce, frustrated tenderness. Without another glance at his stunned counsel, he guided me away from the great hall, his hand never leaving the small of my back. We moved down a long, echoing corridor carved from the living rock of the mountain. Torches set in iron sconces sputtered and hissed, their flames throwing our shadows long and distorted against the stone. The air grew cooler, but the heat from his body kept the chill at bay. Every step we took was a step further into his world, into the heart of the curse, and with every beat of my heart, the treacherous hope inside me grew louder. He led me to a heavy wooden door, bound with black iron, and pushed it open. He ushered me inside and then followed, closing the door behind us with a soft, definitive click that sealed us in and the rest of the world out. The room was a stark reflection of him. It was spacious, dominated by a large bed covered in thick black and gray furs, and a stone hearth where a low fire was already burning, chasing the gloom from the corners. There were no frivolous decorations, only shelves carved into the rock holding leather-bound books, and a heavy wooden table with a single chair. It was a warrior's chamber, a solitary king's refuge, and it smelled overwhelmingly of him, that intoxicating, dangerous scent of storm, iron, and solitude. I stood frozen just inside the door, a ragged, filthy creature in a chamber of austere power. I was a stain on the stone floor, a piece of debris washed up on the shore of his kingdom. He moved past me, his presence filling the room, making it feel both smaller and infinitely more charged. He went to a large chest at the foot of the bed and lifted the lid. He rummaged for a moment before pulling out a soft, dark tunic and a pair of worn leather breeches. They were his, far too large for me, but they were clean. He turned and held them out. I stared at the clothes, then at him, uncomprehending. He gestured toward a small alcove I hadn't noticed, where a basin of steaming water sat on a wooden stand, a cake of lye soap and a clean cloth beside it. My throat felt thick. My eyes burned. It was a simple offering, clothes, water, soap, but for someone who had only ever worn cast-offs and washed in icy streams, it was a kindness so profound it felt like a physical blow. I took a hesitant step forward and accepted the clothes, my fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric, a jolt that went straight up my arm and settled deep in my chest. I quickly pulled back, clutching the soft wool of the tunic to my chest like a shield. He watched me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I felt a flush of shame creep up my neck. I was dirty. My hair was a matted nest. My feet were bleeding. I was not worthy of this chamber, of these clean clothes, of his attention. As if reading my thoughts, his gaze dropped to my feet. I instinctively tried to hide them, tucking one behind the other. He crossed the distance between us in 2 silent strides. My breath hitched. I braced myself, expecting, I didn't know what. Annoyance? Impatience? Instead, he did the last thing I could have ever imagined. He knelt. For the second time that night, the Alpha of Shadows, Kalen Daymar, knelt before me. He took my arm gently, his grip warm and steady, and guided me to the edge of the hearth, bidding me to sit on the raised stone ledge. The fire warmed my back as I numbly obeyed. He took the cloth from the basin, dipped it into the steaming water, and wrung it out. Then, with a tenderness that shattered my composure completely, he began to clean the cuts on my feet. His large, calloused hands that had undoubtedly taken lives and broken his enemies, were impossibly gentle. He washed away the dirt and the dried blood. His touch careful, methodical. I watched him, my vision blurring. A single tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. He paused, his gaze lifting to meet mine. He saw the tear, and a muscle jumped in his scarred jaw. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his other hand and, with the pad of his thumb, brushed the tear away. His touch was rough and gentle all at once, a paradox that defined him. The silence in the room was a living thing. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the soft sound of the cloth on my skin, and the frantic, silent screaming of my own heart. The ghost of my wolf was no longer whimpering. It was pressing against the inside of my soul, yearning to break free, to answer the impossible call of this man. It recognized him in a way my human mind could not comprehend. It knew him as its other half, its completion. He finished his task and rose, moving back to the basin. I stared at my feet, now clean, the cuts stark against my pale skin. He had tended to my wounds. He had cared for me. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The stark reality of my situation dwarfed with the dreamlike surreality of his actions. He was my prophesied doom, yet he treated me like something to be cherished. I finally found the courage to look at him properly, to study the man and not the myth. The firelight played over the landscape of his face, softening the hard edges, illuminating the silver of his scars. I saw the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders, the deep loneliness in the depths of his eyes. He was not a monster. He was a prisoner, chained to a fate he had never chosen. And by claiming me, he had just chained me to it too. My hand lifted of its own accord. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and hesitated an inch from his face. I wanted to trace the scar that cut from his temple down his cheek. I wanted to know its story. I wanted to understand the pain that had carved it there. He went utterly still, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't pull away. He didn't move forward. He simply waited, giving me the choice. My courage failed me. I let my hand drop back into my lap, clenching it into a fist. He closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them again, the mask was back in place. The moment of vulnerability was over. "You should rest," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was the first thing he'd said to me since we entered the room. He turned to leave and a sudden, sharp panic seized me. I couldn't be left alone. Not here, in this strange, intimidating fortress, with the echoes of Alara's prophecy ringing in my ears. I scrambled to my feet, a silent plea in my eyes. He paused at the door, his back to me. "Alara and Gregor will not harm you," he said, as if sensing my fear. "No one in this hold will lay a hand on you. You are under my protection." He paused, his hand on the iron latch. "That is my oath now." He opened the door to leave, and I knew I was about to lose him to the shadows and the arguments and the weight of his world. Before he could step through, he stopped one last time. He turned his head just enough to look at me over his shoulder, his profile a stark, powerful silhouette. Against the torchlight of the hall, "They speak of a curse that withers," he said, his voice barely a whisper, a secret meant only for me. "They never considered a bond that might heal." And with that cryptic, impossible statement, he was gone, the door closing with a soft thud that echoed the frantic beating of my heart. I was left alone in his room, wearing his scent, wrapped in his warmth, with his terrifying, hopeful words burning in the air around me. A bond that might heal? It was a concept so foreign, so contrary to the legend that defined him, that it felt like a madness or a prayer. I stood in the center of Kalen's chamber, a ghost draped in borrowed clothes, his impossible words echoing in the stone-walled silence. A bond that might heal. It was a seed of defiance planted in the barren soil of a century-old prophecy. Hope was a dangerous, unfamiliar thing, a fragile bird taking flight in a storm. I had been taught to crush it, to see it as the first step toward inevitable disappointment. Yet as I clutched the soft wool of his tunic, his scent enveloping me, the tiny, treacherous bird in my chest kept beating its wings. The steam from the basin had cooled, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to hold the secrets of the fortress. I moved stiffly to the basin and washed my face and hands, the cool water a shock against my skin. The reflection that stared back at me from the dark water was a stranger, a gaunt, wide-eyed creature with tangled hair and a smudge of dirt on her cheek that Kalen's thumb had missed. I scrubbed at it, feeling the faint, lingering warmth of his touch. Sleep was an impossibility. My mind was a battlefield, warring thoughts clashing like swords. The primal, instinctual part of me, the wolf I never knew I had, felt a profound sense of rightness. It had found its anchor, its home. It trusted Kalen with a certainty that was absolute and terrifying. But my human mind, the part that had endured a decade of scorn and survival, screamed that it was a trap. Kindness from an alpha was a currency spent for a purpose. Kalen's gentleness was a lure, his protection a cage, and the bond he spoke of was the very thing Alara had named my death sentence. Drawn by an irresistible curiosity, I moved toward the shelves carved into the rock. The books were old, their leather bindings cracked and worn. I ran my fingers over their spines, tracing the faded gilt titles. They were not tales of glory or conquest, but histories, genealogies, and treatises on pack law and lore. This was the library of a ruler burdened by his legacy. On a lower shelf, one book stood apart. It was smaller, bound in dark, unmarked leather, its edges worn smooth from countless readings. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with significance. I carried it to the hearth and sat on the furs spread on the floor, angling the pages toward the dying light of the embers. The book fell open to a page marked by a thin strip of dried leather. The script was elegant, feminine, a stark contrast to the brutal masculinity of the fortress. It was a journal. The moon weeps for him, the entry began. It gave him its power, its shadow, its ferocity, but it took his light in return. My son, my beautiful, storm-eyed boy. The healers say the bond with his father is what weakens me, that Kalen's curse leeches my strength through the link. My love, they say, is my undoing, but they are wrong. It is not love that kills. It is the fear that poisons it. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. Kalen's mother. I was holding his mother's final thoughts, her desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative of their family's curse. It is the fear that poisons it. Her words echoed Alara's, yet twisted them into something new. The prophecy wasn't just about a bond that killed. It was about a love that was not strong enough to withstand the fear. A soft knock at the door made me jump, and I shoved the journal under a fur throw. The door creaked open, and Alara stepped inside, her face a mask of stern disapproval. She carried a wooden tray laden with a bowl of steaming stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a mug of water. She placed it on the heavy table without a word, her movements precise and full of rigid control. Her sharp eyes swept the room, lingering on the basin of used water, the clothes I wore, the indentation on the hearth where Kalen had knelt. Her gaze was an accusation. She finally looked at me, her expression softening almost imperceptibly, the fury replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "You should eat," she said, her voice clipped, but not entirely unkind. I remained on the floor, clutching the fur, my silence a wall between us. Alara sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You do not speak," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact she had already confirmed. "Another flaw. Another piece that does not fit. Do you understand what he has done, child? What he has brought upon you?" I met her gaze, and for the first time, I did not look away. I held her stare, pouring all my fear, my confusion, and the tiny, defiant spark of Kalen's words into my eyes. She seemed to understand. She pulled the single chair from the table and sat, a queen holding court in a prison. "The Daymar line is old," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "It is touched by the first moon, the one that hangs in the sky and the one that sleeps in the heart of the mountain. It grants our alphas immense power, a connection to the shadows, to the very rock of this land. But such power demands a price. The alpha's mate, the Luna, must be a vessel strong enough to anchor that power. She must be a true North Star in his dark sky. If she is not, the bond becomes a siphon. His power, raw and untamed, will draw her life force into his, leaving her a hollow shell." Her eyes bored into me. His mother, Lyra, was a strong alpha female from the Sunstone Pack. She was vibrant, full of life, but the fear, the whispers of the curse were already ancient. She began to doubt. She feared the bond, feared him, and that fear created a crack in the vessel. The power found the flaw and poured through. We watched her fade. Kalen watched her fade. A cold dread washed over me, chilling me more than any winter wind. I was not a strong alpha female. I was a broken omega, wolfless and mute. I was not a vessel. I was a sieve, already full of holes. "He swore his oath that day," Ilara continued, her voice low and grim, "to never take a mate, to let the Daymar line end with him. He would bear the curse alone. He locked his heart in a cage of iron and ash and threw away the key. For decades he has ruled with a cold, hard justice. He has kept this pack safe, strong. He has been a king of shadows, untouchable, until tonight." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. He scented you, and the wolf, the primal beast that lives in him, recognized you. The fates are cruel, child. They have woven your thread with his, but the pattern they weave is one of death. His wolf does not understand the prophecy. It only understands mate. It is his mind, his heart, the man who remembers his mother wasting away, that fights it. She gestured around the room. This care, this gentleness. It is the man warring with the curse. He seeks to protect you from the very thing he is. But he cannot win. The bond has already begun to form. I can feel it in the air. A low hum beneath the stones of this fortress. The more time you spend with him, the stronger it will grow. And the stronger it grows, the quicker you will wither. She stood, her duty done. I do not hate you, Ardenvale. I hate the doom you represent. Flee if you can. While the bond is still new, while there is still a chance you might escape its grasp. Run from this place. Run from him. It is the only mercy you will find. She turned and left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving me alone with the scent of stew and the chilling certainty of my own demise. Flee? The thought was a wild, panicked bird beating against the cage of my ribs. Ilara's logic was flawless, her warning sincere. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to obey, to steal away into the night and disappear. I could go north, to the frozen wastes, where no packs roamed, and live out my days in cold solitude. It would be a half-life, but it would be a life. I looked around the room, at the warm furs, the clean clothes, the food left for me. I thought of Kalen kneeling at my feet, his touch a brand of impossible tenderness. I thought of the fear in his eyes, a fear not for himself, but for me. I thought of his mother's words. It is the fear that poisons it. What if Ilara was wrong? What if Lyra was right? What if the poison wasn't the bond, but the doubt? What if the vessel didn't need to be strong, but merely willing, open? What if the cure for a love poisoned by fear was a love that refused to be afraid? It was a mad thought, the desperate prayer of a condemned woman. But it was my own. It was the first truly defiant thought I had allowed myself in a decade. My hand went to my throat. I had not spoken a word since my parents were killed, since my pack was shattered. The trauma had stolen my voice, leaving me a silent ghost. But now something was different. A strange, unfamiliar warmth was spreading through my chest, a tingling energy that seemed to emanate from the very center of my being. It was the bond, just as Ilara had described. But it did not feel like a siphon. It did not feel like it was draining me. It felt like it was filling me. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. I walked to the table and dipped the bread into the stew, my hands trembling. I ate, forcing the food down past the knot of fear in my stomach. Strength. I needed strength. Not to run, but to stay. The door opened again, but this time it was not Ilara. It was Kalen. He stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space. He had shed his outer leather tunic and wore a simple gray shirt that did little to hide the powerful muscles of his chest and shoulders. His face was etched with exhaustion. His storm gray eyes shadowed with the weight of the arguments I knew he must have been fighting. He looked at the half-eaten bowl of stew, and a flicker of relief crossed his features. He did not enter. He simply stood there, a guardian at the threshold, watching me. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, with the hum of the nascent bond between us. He had given me an out. Ilara had shown me the door. The path of survival was clear. Run. But as I looked at him, at this cursed, lonely king who had shown me more kindness in a few hours than I had received in a lifetime, I knew I couldn't take it. To flee would be to prove the prophecy right. It would be to succumb to the very fear that had poisoned his mother. To run from him would be to run from the only home my soul had ever known. I took a deep breath, feeling the strange new energy humming inside me. I opened my mouth, my throat tight with disuse, my vocal cords like rusted strings. I focused on his eyes, on the loneliness I saw there, and I pushed. A sound emerged. It was not a word. It was a broken, raspy croak, a sound of agony and effort. But it was a sound. My sound. Kalen's eyes widened, his glacial composure shattering. He took a step into the room, then another, his gaze locked on my mouth, as if I had just performed a miracle. I tried again, channeling every ounce of will I possessed, every flicker of the defiant hope he had ignited in me. The word was fractured, hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was there. It was real. Stay. The word, a shard of sound from a decade of silence, hung in the air between us. It was a ruin of a word, rusted and broken, but it was a bridge. Kalen froze, his hand still on the doorframe, his entire body rigid with a kind of violent stillness. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, gathering around him as if drawn to the sudden, seismic shift in his composure. His storm-gray eyes, which had been clouded with exhaustion and the grim realities of his counsel, were now a raging tempest of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at my lips, then his gaze flew to my eyes, searching, questioning, daring to believe. My throat burned from the effort. My lungs ached. The single word had been a monumental act of will, a reclaiming of a part of myself I thought was lost forever. Tears pricked my eyes, not of sadness, but of a fierce, painful triumph. I had spoken, to him, for him. I had answered Alara's challenge not by fleeing, but by rooting myself more deeply in this impossible reality. He crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides, the floor seeming to tremble beneath his feet. He didn't stop until he was standing before me, so close I had to crane my neck back to see his face. The sheer intensity of his presence was overwhelming, a physical force that made the air thick and hard to breathe. He was searching my face, his expression a maelstrom of conflict, disbelief warring with a raw, desperate hope. "Say it again," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural growl that vibrated through my bones. It was not the command of an alpha to a subordinate. It was the plea of a drowning man begging for a rope. I swallowed, the simple act painful. I looked into the swirling gray of his eyes and saw past the alpha, past the curse, to the lonely, scarred man beneath. I saw the prisoner rattling the bars of his cage. My resolve hardened. I had found my voice to keep him here, and I would use it again to anchor him. I opened my mouth, focusing all my energy. "Stay," I whispered, the sound a little clearer this time, a little stronger. It was still a ghost of a word, but it was mine. A shudder went through his massive frame. He closed his eyes, his head dropping forward as if under a great weight, his dark hair falling across his brow. A ragged breath escaped him, a sound of such profound relief it was almost a sob. He reached out, not to touch me, but to brace himself against the stone wall beside my head, his fingers digging into the unyielding rock. When he opened his eyes again, the storm in them had broken, leaving behind a raw, unguarded vulnerability that stole my breath. He had built his entire world upon an oath of solitude. He had accepted his fate, embraced the emptiness, and ruled from a throne of iron and ash. My whispered word was a chisel against the foundations of that world. It was a flaw in the prophecy, a variable the legends had never accounted for. A mute omega should not have been able to speak. A cursed bond should not have been able to heal. "Arden," he breathed, my name a prayer on his lips. It was the first time he had said it, and the sound of it in his deep voice resonated with the humming bond between us, making my nascent wolf stir and press against the confines of my soul. His hand left the wall and came to my face, his calloused palm cupping my jaw with a reverence that made my knees weak. His thumb stroked my cheekbone, a slow, deliberate caress. The contact was electric, a current of warmth and life that flowed directly from him to me, chasing away the last of the chill that had lived in my bones for a decade. It didn't feel like he was draining me. It felt like he was pouring his own formidable strength into my depleted reserves. "How?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "For 10 years, Boren's report said you were broken. Silent. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't form the words to describe the flicker of life I felt when he first looked at me, the way the bond felt not like a siphon, but a wellspring. So I simply shook my head, my eyes conveying what my voice could not. It was you. He seemed to understand. His gaze intensified, and he leaned closer, his forehead coming to rest against mine. We stood there, breathing the same air, his scent, storm and iron, and the deep, clean smell of the mountain, filling my senses. His thumb continued its hypnotic stroking, and I felt the tension of a lifetime begin to unspool within me. For the first time since my family was slaughtered, I felt safe. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation. Here in the arms of the most feared shifter on the continent, the man prophesied to be my doom, I had found a sanctuary. "They want me to send you away," he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. "Ilara, Gregor, the entire council. They see you as the final blow, the fulfillment of the curse. They say your presence weakens the pack, that my focus on you is a liability." His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on my jaw. "They do not see what I see." I pulled back just enough to look at him. "What do you see?" my eyes asked. "I see a flicker of dawn in an endless night," he whispered, his gaze tracing my features as if memorizing them. "When I scented you in that clearing, it was like a compass needle finding its true north after a lifetime of spinning. My wolf has been a caged beast since my mother died, a thing of rage and shadow. But when it saw you, it was not rage it felt. It was recognition. It was peace." He shook his head, a look of grim wonder on his face. "This bond, it is not like the one my parents shared. I remember theirs. It was a desperate, grasping thing, poisoned by my father's fear of his own power and my mother's fear of the prophecy. It was a knot of anxiety, but this—" He pressed the palm of his hand flat against my chest, over my heart. I could feel the heat of his touch through the thin tunic, a steady, grounding pressure. "This feels solid. It feels like the mountain itself, ancient, right." My heart was hammering against his palm, a frantic drumbeat answering the steady rhythm of his own. The humming between us intensified, a tangible vibration in the air. I felt a strange heat begin to pool at the base of my spine, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and everything to do with the awakening of my dormant wolf. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his control snapping back into place. He took a step back, putting distance between us, the air crackling in the sudden void. The king was reasserting himself over the man. "Ilara was right about one thing," he said, his voice regaining its command. "The bond is growing stronger, and until I understand its nature, whether it is a cure or a more subtle poison, you are in danger, not just from the curse, but from my own pack. Many still believe the old laws. They will see you as a threat, a weakness in their alpha that must be cut out." A cold spike of fear lanced through me, eclipsing the warmth of a moment before. I had forgotten the world outside this room. I had forgotten Ilara's stern face, Bourne's cruelty, the pack that saw me as a contamination. "I will not let them harm you," Kalen stated, his voice ringing with the authority of his iron oath. "But I cannot shield you forever within these walls. If you are to stay here, if you are to be mine—" He faltered on the word, as if its implications were too vast to comprehend. "Then they must see you not as a stray, but as one of us. They must see your strength." I looked down at my own hands, at my frail body. Strength? I had none. My only skill was survival through invisibility. As if hearing my thoughts, he continued, "The trial of the shadowed moon is in 3 nights. It is an ancient rite, a test of will and endurance for those who wish to prove their worth to the pack. It does not require a wolf. It requires a heart of stone and a will of iron." He paused, his gray eyes pinning me. "No Omega has ever attempted it. Most fail." My blood ran cold. A trial, a public test of a strength I did not possess. It was a death sentence of a different kind. "I will not force you," he said, his voice softening again. "The choice is yours. You can remain here, hidden, and I will protect you. Or you can face the trial. If you succeed, no one in this pack will ever dare to call you stray again. They will see you as the moon chose you to be. He was offering me a choice between a gilded cage and a public execution, but hidden within his words was a powerful truth. He believed I could succeed. This fearsome alpha, who had seen nothing but my brokenness, somehow saw a strength in me that I had never known. He wasn't just offering me a place in his pack. He was offering me a chance to reclaim myself. I thought of the years of scorn, of being called wolfless, barren, weak. I thought of kneeling in the dirt while the Blackwood pack laughed. I thought of a lifetime of being invisible. Kaelin had seen me. He had pulled me from the shadows, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that I could never go back. I met his gaze, my decision made. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but resolve was a fire in my blood. I would not be the weakness that fulfilled a prophecy. I would be the flaw that broke it. My voice was still a fragile thing, but I imbued it with all the iron I could find in the depths of my soul. I spoke his name for the first time, and the word felt like a key turning in a lock. Kaelin, I will do it. The 3 days leading up to the trial of the shadowed moon were a blur of muted terror and burgeoning strength. Kaelin did not confine me to his chambers. Instead, under his watchful, ever-present protection, I was made to walk the halls of Shadowhold. It was a deliberate act, a statement to his pack. She is here, she is mine. Accustom yourselves to it. The reactions were what I expected. Whispers followed me like ghosts down the stone corridors. Shifters would stop their work, their faces hardening into masks of suspicion and contempt as I passed. I saw it in their eyes. I was the Omega Stray, the Cursebringer, the weakness their alpha had inexplicably claimed. Alara's demeanor remained one of cold professional civility, but her gaze was heavy with the weight of her grim predictions. Gregor, the gnarled old warrior, simply ignored me, his disapproval a palpable force field. Yet something within me was changing. With every hostile glare I met, with every venomous whisper I endured, a core of defiance hardened inside me. Kaelin's belief in me was a shield, but the memory of my own voice was a sword. I had spent a decade bowing my head, making myself small. Now I forced myself to walk with my shoulders back, my chin held high. I was terrified, but I would not let them see it. I was Arden Vale, and I would not be defined by their fear. The bond between Kaelin and me was a silent, thrumming undercurrent to everything. It was a constant, low hum in my blood, a warmth that had settled deep in my chest. We spoke little. My voice was still a fragile instrument, and he seemed to understand that words were not what we needed. Instead, we communicated in shared glances across the crowded feasting hall. In the light pressure of his hand on my back, as he guided me through a throng of hostile warriors. In the quiet moments when he would find me staring out at the unforgiving peaks from a high balcony and simply stand beside me, a silent, solid presence against the vast emptiness, I felt stronger. The gaunt creature from the Blackwood clearing was slowly being replaced by someone new. Ilara, despite her disapproval, ensured I was fed. Hearty stews, dense bread, roasted meats, and the food, combined with the energy I seemed to draw from the bond, began to fill out my frame. The most startling change, however, was internal. The ghost of my wolf, once a dormant ember, was now a steady, pulsing warmth. It was not a wolf of rage or ferocity, but one of resilience. It was the part of me that had endured, the part that refused to break, and it was growing. The night of the trial arrived with a chilling wind that howled down from the mountain peaks, rattling the iron-bound shutters of the fortress. A new moon hid the sky in a shroud of impenetrable blackness, a fitting omen for a trial of shadows. Ilara came to my room, a chamber adjoining Kaelin's that he had given me, with a set of practical, dark leather breeches and a simple tunic. Her hands were gentle as she helped me braid my tangled hair back from my face, but her eyes were filled with a profound sorrow. "There is no shame in refusing," she said softly, her fingers working deftly. "He will protect you. You do not have to do this. Yes, I managed to say, my voice still raspy but firm. I do. She finished the braid and met my eyes in the small, polished silver mirror on the wall. His mother said the curse was not in the bond, but in the fear, she whispered, a confession. I pray to the old gods she was right. I pray I am wrong. When I was ready, Kalen was waiting for me outside my door. He was dressed not as an alpha in commanding leathers, but in the same simple dark garb as his warriors. Tonight he was not just my protector, he was a judge, a witness. His storm-gray eyes swept over me, and I saw a flicker of pride warring with a deep, consuming anxiety. He said nothing, but he held out his hand. I placed my hand in his fingers wrapped around mine, his grip warm and strong, a silent transfer of strength and resolve. Together we walked from the keep, down the winding stone paths toward the ceremonial grounds at the mountain's base. The entire pack was gathered, a silent sea of bodies illuminated by the flickering orange light of a dozen massive bonfires. They formed a great circle around a stark, jagged pit in the earth. The trial of the shadowed moon, was not a test of combat. It was a test of the soul. The challenger had to descend into the maw, a labyrinth of lightless, claustrophobic tunnels that wormed their way into the heart of the mountain. Within these tunnels, the mountain itself tested you. Illusions born of your deepest fears, echoes of your past traumas, the crushing weight of absolute solitude and darkness, all were weapons the mountain used to break you. To succeed, you had to navigate the labyrinth, find the chamber of the moonstone at its heart, and bring back a single shard of the glowing rock before the first rays of dawn. Most who entered were found days later, huddled in a side tunnel, their minds shattered by their own demons. Kalen led me to the edge of the pit. He released my hand, and the loss of his touch was a physical cold. He stepped back to join Gregor and Alara, taking his place as alpha. I was alone, the focus of hundreds of pairs of watching eyes. The air was thick with their doubt, their scorn, their morbid curiosity. Gregor stepped forward, his voice a gravelly proclamation that carried over the crackle of the fires. Ardyn Vale, the stray of Silvercrest, has claimed the right of trial. She seeks to prove her worth to the Blackwood Mountain Pack. The mountain will be the judge. Enter the maw, find the Heartstone, return with the dawn, or be consumed by the darkness. He stepped back. This was it. There was no ceremony, no blessing, just the stark command. I looked at the dark, gaping hole in the earth, and a primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my resolve. My breath hitched. My legs felt like lead. The whispers of the crowd grew louder, a hiss of certainty. She will fail. The Omega will break. My eyes found Kalen. He stood like a statue carved from the night, his face an unreadable mask of granite. But his eyes were locked on mine, and in their turbulent depths, I saw it again, not pity, not command, but a fierce, unwavering belief. It was a lifeline in a sea of doubt. He believed I could do this. He had seen the iron in my soul when I had seen only ash. Drawing a deep, shuddering breath, I turned my back on the pack, on Kalen, on the firelight, and lowered myself into the maw. The darkness was absolute. It was not just an absence of light. It was a physical presence, a thick, cold blanket that smothered the senses. The air was stale and smelled of damp earth and old stone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of my heart. I took a tentative step, my hands outstretched, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough-hewn rock of the tunnel wall. Panic, slick and oily, began to rise in my throat. I was alone, utterly, completely alone. The jeers of the Blackwood Pack, the contempt of the Shadowhold shifters, all of it was preferable to this suffocating silence, this crushing solitude. It is the fear that poisons it. His mother's words, my own defiance, I would not let fear be my undoing. I clung to the wall and forced myself to take another step, then another. The tunnel was narrow, forcing me to turn sideways in places. It twisted and turned, and soon I was hopelessly disoriented, with no sense of direction, no sense of how far I had come. or how far I had to go then. The mountain began its work. A whisper slithered through the darkness, coiling around me like a snake, wolfless. It was Alphaboran's voice, dripping with malice. I stumbled, my heart seizing. The voice was followed by another, Fenris's cruel laughter echoing off the unseen walls. Barren, worthless, stray. The voices of my past, of every insult, every moment of humiliation, rose around me. They were phantoms, but their words were as sharp as knives, cutting into the fragile armor of my newfound resolve. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my ears, but the voices were inside my head. They were my own fears, given voice by the mountain's magic. You are nothing. He will tire of you. He will see the weakness in you and cast you aside. The curse will take you, and you will die alone in the dark. A sob tore from my throat. The panic was a living thing now, clawing at my chest, stealing my air. I sank to my knees, the damp cold earth seeping through my breeches. They were right. I was a fool. What strength did I have? I was a broken Omega playing at being a warrior. I would die here, and Kalen would be forced to admit his mistake. His pack would be proven right. As I huddled there, lost in a spiral of despair, a new sensation pushed through the fog of fear. It was a faint, steady warmth in the center of my chest, the bond. It was a thin, silvery thread in the oppressive darkness, a connection to the man waiting for me above. I focused on it, clung to it like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was a reminder that I was not truly alone. He was up there, his will a silent beacon in the night. He believes in you. The thought was my own, but it shone with the intensity of his conviction. I took a shaky breath, then another. The phantom voices of my past began to recede, their power waning against the simple, solid truth of the bond. I was not worthless to him. I was not a weakness to him. He had called me his dawn. Slowly, I pushed myself back to my feet. My legs were trembling, but they held. I would not be broken by ghosts. I placed my hand on the wall and began to walk again, my steps more certain. The bond was my compass now, a steady, pulsing warmth that seemed to subtly guide me, urging me left at one fork, right at another. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, and in the center of the cavern I saw them, my parents. They stood as I last remembered them, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the shock of their deaths, their clothes stained with blood. "Why didn't you save us, Arden?" my mother whispered, her voice a hollow echo. "You were weak," my father accused, his voice full of a disappointment more painful than any physical blow. "You hid while we died. You let our pack fall." This illusion was 1,000 times more potent than the whispers. The grief and guilt I had buried for a decade erupted, a raw, screaming wound. Tears streamed down my face. I reached for them, my fingers passing through their shimmering forms. They were not real, but the pain was I fell to my knees, my voice finally breaking free in a silent, agonized scream. The trauma that had stolen my voice was here, laid bare by the mountain's cruel magic. I was that terrified, helpless child all over again, hiding in the root cellar, listening to the sounds of my world being torn apart. A bond that might heal. Kalen's words, spoken in the firelight of his chamber. He had knelt and cleaned the wounds on my feet. He had touched the scars on my soul with his impossible gentleness. He had not healed me, but he had given me the strength to heal myself. I looked at the phantoms of my parents, at the grief that had held me prisoner for so long. "I was a child," I whispered, my voice cracking, the words tearing through the scar tissue on my soul. "I was afraid, but I am not that child anymore." I pushed myself to my feet, my gaze unwavering. "I survived. I will honor you by living. I will honor you by being strong." As I spoke, the images of my parents flickered and dissolved, like smoke on the wind. The cavern was empty once more. A profound sense of peace settled over me. The mountain had thrown its worst at me, the very source of my brokenness, and I had endured. The ghost in my throat was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady strength. I walked through the cavern and found a single tunnel leading out the other side. The air here was different, humming with a strange, vibrant energy. A soft silver-blue light emanated from around the next bend. My heart began to pound with a new emotion, not fear, but anticipation. I rounded the corner and stopped, breathless. I was in a vast, cathedral-like grotto. The walls were lined with shimmering crystals, and in the very center, rising from a pool of perfectly still water, was a massive, uncut stone that glowed with a soft, internal luminescence. The moonstone, the heart of the mountain. I had made it. I waded into the pool, the water shockingly cold but cleansing. I reached the heartstone and placed my hand upon its surface. It was cool and smooth, and a wave of calm, powerful energy flowed into me, mingling with the warmth of the bond. It felt like coming home. I broke off a small, sharp shard from the edge. It glowed in my palm, a captured piece of moonlight. Clutching my prize, I turned to leave. The journey back was a blur. The illusions were gone, the whispers silenced. The mountain had tested me, and I had been found worthy. I followed the bond, that unwavering thread of connection to Kaylin, and it guided me through the labyrinthine dark with unerring certainty. Finally, I saw it, a faint gray rectangle of light ahead. The entrance, the dawn was breaking. I pulled myself from the maw, blinking against the pale morning light. I was covered in mud and grime, my body aching, my soul scoured clean. The pack was still there, a silent circle of disbelieving faces. Their scorn was gone, replaced by a grudging, stunned respect. Alara's face was wet with tears, and Gregor's jaw was slack with shock. My eyes found Kaylin. He had not moved from his spot, but he was no longer a granite statue. Every line of his body was taut with restrained emotion. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. I walked toward him, my steps steady, my head held high. I stopped before him and opened my hand, presenting the glowing shard of moonstone. He did not take it. Instead, he reached out and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping the dirt from my cheeks. His eyes were a storm of emotions I could not name. Pride, relief, a fierce, possessive adoration that was so potent it was a physical force. "Arden," he breathed, his voice thick. And then, in front of his entire pack, in the first light of the new day, he lowered his head and claimed my lips with his. The kiss was not gentle. It was a brand, a claim, an elemental collision of shadow and dawn. It was the breaking of an oath and the forging of a new one. It was the sealing of a bond that was never meant to be, and the first tremor in the foundations of a curse that was about to be shattered. And in that kiss, I felt my wolf, whole and vibrant and free for the first time, rise up and howl in silent, ecstatic triumph. The world dissolved into the press of his lips against mine. The shock of it, the raw, possessive power of it, sent a bolt of lightning straight through my soul. The murmurs of the stunned pack, the pale light of dawn, the ache in my muscles, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only Kaylin, his taste a wild mix of pine, iron, and the ozone of an approaching storm. His kiss was not a gentle exploration. It was a desperate, primal declaration, a truth he could no longer contain. My fingers, still clutching the shard of moonstone, uncurled. The glowing rock fell to the packed earth with a soft clink, forgotten. My hands came up to grip his arms, anchoring myself in the tempest. He groaned, a low guttural sound of pure need, and one of his hands slid from my face to the small of my back, pulling me flush against the hard wall of his body. There was no space left between us, no air, no doubt. We were two halves of a fractured whole, crashing together with the force of destiny. The nascent wolf within me, awakened and emboldened by the trial, surged forward with a joyous ferocity. It met the magnificent, shadowy beast inside him, and there was no clash, no fight for dominance. There was only a profound, soul-deep recognition, mine. The word echoed in the deepest parts of me, not as his claim, but as our shared truth. He broke the kiss, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his forehead resting against mine. His storm-gray eyes were dark, turbulent pools of emotion, the iron walls of his control completely shattered. I could feel the tremors running through his powerful frame, a testament to the battle he had just lost, or won. "Let the pack see," he murmured, his voice a raw rasp meant only for me. "Let the mountain bear witness. You are not a stray they will tolerate. You are the Luna they will worship." His words were a coronation. Luna, the title was so foreign, so impossibly grand, I couldn't comprehend it. I was Arden the broken, Arden the mute, Arden the stray, but as I looked into his eyes, I saw that woman no longer existed. In his gaze, I was remade. He straightened to his full, intimidating height, his arm a possessive band of steel around my waist, keeping me tucked securely against his side. He turned to face his pack, his expression shifting from raw emotion to the unyielding authority of the Alpha of Alans. His gaze swept over the silent, awestruck shifters. "The trial is complete," his voice boomed, ringing with a power that vibrated in the morning air. "She has faced the darkness within the mountain and emerged with the dawn. She has proven her strength, her will, her heart of iron. She is Arden of Shadowhold, my mate, your Luna." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Alara stood with a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Gregor's face was a study in stunned disbelief, but among the younger warriors a new expression was dawning, one of grudging respect, of wonder. They had witnessed an impossibility. A wolfless Omega had not only survived the Maw, she had triumphed, and their Alpha had claimed her without reservation. The foundations of their world were shaking. "Any who dispute this," Kalen continued, his voice dropping to a lethal growl, "will answer to me." The challenge hung in the air, thick and heavy. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was an assent, a surrender to the undeniable truth of what they had just witnessed. The bond between us, now openly declared, was a visible aura of power, a shimmering energy that even the most skeptical among them could not deny. Kalen gave them one last hard glare before turning and guiding me back toward the fortress. He stooped to retrieve the fallen moonstone shard, pressing its cool, smooth surface into my palm before closing my fingers around it. "A reminder," he said softly, "of the strength you found in the darkness." We walked through the pack, and this time there were no whispers, no contemptuous glares. They parted for us, their heads bowed in deference. They were not just bowing to their Alpha, they were bowing to me. The feeling was so dizzying, so overwhelming, that I could only focus on the solid warmth of Kalen's arm around me, the steady rhythm of his steps beside mine. Once we were within the fortress walls, away from the prying eyes of the pack, the rigid control he had maintained finally broke. He swept me up into his arms, his stride long and urgent as he carried me through the echoing corridors, past stunned servants and guards, directly to his chambers. He kicked the door shut behind us, the sound echoing the finality of his public declaration. He didn't put me down. He carried me to the great hearth, where the embers still glowed, and sank onto the thick furs, cradling me in his lap as if I were the most precious treasure in his kingdom. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breath hot against my skin, his body trembling with the force of his unleashed emotions. "When you were in there," he rasped, his voice muffled by my hair, "I felt everything, every phantom whisper, every memory that haunted you. I felt your fear, and I could do nothing. The laws of the trial forbid it. It was the purest form of torture I have ever known." I threaded my fingers into his dark hair, holding him close. The bond had not just been a compass for me. It had been a window for him. He had walked through the darkness with me, a silent, helpless passenger to my pain. But then I felt it change, he continued, lifting his head to look at me, his eyes blazing with a fierce pride. "I felt your will harden. I felt you face them, the ghosts of your past. I felt you win, Arden. You did not just survive the mountain, you conquered it. I wasn't alone. I whispered, my voice stronger now, clearer. I felt you. You were my guide. A look of profound wonder crossed his face. The bond, he breathed. It is not a siphon. It is a conduit, a bridge between our souls. My mother was right. The curse was never the power. It was the fear that twisted it. The full implication of his words settled over me. The prophecy that had defined his life, that had condemned him to a lonely throne, was built on a lie. It was not his mate's weakness that drained her life, but her inability to trust in the bond, in him. A Luna with a heart full of fear would wither, but a Luna with a will of iron. What does this mean, Kaylin? I asked, my heart pounding. It means everything, he said, his hand coming up to cup my face, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. It means my oath is dust. It means my future is not written in ash, but in the light you brought with you from the heart of the mountain. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was the opposite of our first. This one was slow, tender, full of reverence, and a decade of pent-up hope. It was a kiss of beginnings, of promises whispered without words. It spoke of quiet mornings and shared silences, of ruling a kingdom of shadows together, two sovereigns of a shared soul. But as he deepened the kiss, a sudden sharp pain lanced through my chest, so intense it made me cry out and arch back in his arms. It was a cold, piercing agony, as if a shard of ice had been driven into my heart. Kaylin pulled back instantly, his face a mask of alarm. Arden, what is it? I gasped for breath, clutching my chest. The warmth of the bond was still there, but it was now threaded with a vein of purest ice. I looked down at my hand, which was still clenched around the shard of moonstone. A thin black line, like a crack in a porcelain glaze, was spreading across its glowing surface. A frantic, desperate look entered Kaylin's eyes. No, he whispered, a sound of pure dread. It's not possible. What? I choked out, the pain making my vision swim. What is it? The Heartstone, he said, his voice strained. It is a reflection of the Alpha's life force, of the mountain's health, the curse. It's not just in me, it's in the land, in the stone. It has been dormant, held in check by my solitude, but the formation of our bond, the declaration, it has awakened it. The black crack on the moonstone spread further, and another wave of agony ripped through me. I cried out, my body convulsing. The bond, our beautiful, miraculous bridge, was now a conduit for the awakened curse. It was pouring the mountain's ancient sickness directly into my soul. Kaylin's face was pale, his expression shattered. The triumph of the dawn was gone, replaced by the stark, visceral horror of the prophecy fulfilling itself in his arms. He had claimed me, and the curse was claiming me in turn. I won't lose you, he snarled, a vow of desperate fury against the gods, against fate itself. He laid me gently on the furs and stood, his form radiating a power so immense the very air in the room seemed to crackle. The legends spoke of how the curse is fed. They never spoke of how it could be broken. He looked at me, his eyes a maelstrom of love and desperate resolve. The poison is in the heart of the mountain, and I will tear it out with my bare hands. The pain was a living entity, a ravenous thing of ice and shadow coiling around my heart. Each beat was a struggle, a gasp against a rising tide of cold. Kaylin's face, etched with a desperate fury, swam in and out of focus. His words, I will tear it out with my bare hands, echoed in the chamber, a king's roar against an implacable fate. He was a force of nature, but the curse was older than the trees, deeper than the mountain's roots. Alara and Gregor burst into the room, their faces ashen. They had felt the shift, the sudden malevolent awakening that had pulsed through the fortress the moment the curse took hold. It is as the prophecy foretold, Gregor rasped, his eyes on the black-veined moonstone shard that had fallen from my hand. The bond has given it a channel. It will consume her. No! Kaylin's voice was the sound of grinding stone. He knelt beside me, his large hands hovering over my chest, afraid to touch me, as if his very skin would hasten the poison. The agony in his eyes was a mirror of my own. The prophecy was a warning, not a sentence. It described the disease. It never said there was no cure. "There is no cure!" Alara cried, her stern composure finally shattering into raw grief. "We have searched the old texts, the lore stones. There is nothing. Only the tale of the first Daymar Alpha, who bound the vengeful moon spirit within the Heartstone to gain his power. The curse is the price. A debt that must be paid in the lifeblood of his Luna." A debt. The word snagged in Kalen's mind, and I felt it through the bond. A flicker of an idea, a desperate, impossible gamble. His eyes, which had been wild with grief, sharpened with a sudden, terrifying focus. He looked from Alara to the moonstone shard, and then to the hearth where the embers still glowed. "A debt," he repeated, his voice low and intense. "Debts can be paid, or they can be transferred." He stood, his movements imbued with a chilling purpose. The first Alpha bound the spirit to the stone. He made the mountain its vessel. He created the curse. Kalen's gaze swept the room, landing on the ancient tapestries depicting his ancestors. Every Alpha since has only managed it, contained it. None have dared to confront it. He looked back at me, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "The bond is a conduit. It flows both ways." Before Alara or Gregor could react, he strode to the hearth and plunged his hand into the glowing red embers. The smell of searing flesh filled the air, a sickening, acrid scent. Gregor lunged forward with a cry of alarm, but Kalen turned, his hand held up. It was burned, blackened, but in his palm he held a single, incandescent coal. He did not seem to feel the pain. His eyes were fixed on me, on the conduit that linked our souls. "Kalen, no!" Alara shrieked, finally understanding his insane purpose. "The curse requires a vessel," he said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction as he walked back towards me. "It has been bound to this mountain for 1,000 years. It is time to give it a new home." He knelt over me, the heat from the coal he held radiating in the cool air. The pain in my chest was becoming a crushing weight, my vision narrowing to a dark tunnel with his face at the far end. I swore an oath in iron and ash to never take a mate, to never allow this curse to harm another account, he whispered, his storm-gray eyes boring into mine, filled with a love so fierce it was a physical force. "I break that oath tonight. I will take a mate, and I will take her curse as my own." He pressed the searing coal into the center of his own chest. A scream ripped from my throat, a sound of shared agony. The bond between us flared, not with icy pain, but with white-hot, cleansing fire. It was no longer a one-way channel for the curse to flow into me. It was a battlefield. Kalen was using our soul bridge to actively draw the poison out of me and into himself. I felt the icy pressure around my heart shatter. The cold receded, chased away by the searing heat of his sacrifice. My vision cleared. I saw him above me, his body rigid, his jaw clenched, sweat beading on his brow as he endured an agony beyond comprehension. The simple burn on his chest was the focal point of a metaphysical war. The black veins on the moonstone shard on the floor began to fade, the soft silver-blue light returning. But across Kalen's chest, spreading out from the burn, dark, jagged lines like frozen lightning began to appear on his skin. He was pulling the curse out of the mountain, out of the stone itself, and binding it to his own flesh and blood. The fortress of Shadowhold groaned around us, the very stones seeming to cry out in protest, as their ancient, corrupted heart was being ripped from them. A low, keening wail echoed from the depths of the mountain, the death cry of the vengeful spirit as it lost its anchor and was drawn into a new, living vessel. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The rumbling ceased. The keening faded into silence. The shard of moonstone on the floor glowed with a pure, untainted light, and Kalen collapsed beside me, his body limp, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The black, lightning-like marks covered his entire torso, a stark, terrifying map of the curse he now carried within him. "Kalen!" I scrambled to his side, my own body weak but free of pain. I cradled his head in my lap, my tears falling onto his pale, sweat-slicked face. His eyes fluttered open, the storm in them calmed to a gentle, exhausted gray. He lifted a trembling hand, the one that wasn't burned, and touched my cheek. "Is it gone?" he rasped. I pressed my own hand to my chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of my own heart, the warm, pure hum of the uncorrupted bond. "It's gone from me," I sobbed. "Kaylin, what have you done?" "I paid the debt," he whispered, a faint, triumphant smile touching his lips. "The curse is no longer in the land. It is in the blood, my blood. It is bound to me, and it will die with me." He had not destroyed the curse. He had contained it, making himself its final prison. He had saved me, saved his pack, saved his mountain, at the cost of his own soul. 6 months later, I stood on the high balcony of the Alpha's chambers, the first snows of winter, dusting the peaks around Shadowhold. The air was crisp and clean. A fragile peace had settled over the mountain, a sense of rightness that had been absent for a millennium. The pack had accepted me, their Luna. With a reverence born from witnessing a miracle, they had seen their Alpha defy a god and claim his dawn. I turned as the chamber door opened. Kaylin walked toward me, his stride as powerful and sure as ever. He wore no shirt, and in the soft morning light, the black marks stood out starkly against his skin. They were a part of him now, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice. They sometimes caused him pain, a deep, aching cold that settled in his bones, but it was a pain he bore with a quiet strength. He came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. His chin rested on the crown of my head, and we stood in a comfortable, familiar silence, watching the snow fall. "The healers say the land is regenerating," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my back. "The streams run clearer. The prey is more abundant. It is as if the whole mountain can finally breathe again." "So can its king," I whispered, turning in his arms to face him. I placed my hand over his heart, over the faint silver scar where he had burned himself, the epicenter of the black markings. The skin was cool to the touch, but beneath it, his heart beat with a strong, steady rhythm. "The curse still lives in you," I said, my voice soft. He looked down at me, his storm-gray eyes full of a love so deep it was an ocean. "It is not a curse anymore, Arden," he said. "It is just a part of me, a shadow to your light, and I would not have it any other way." He lowered his head and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss, full of the promise of 1,000 snowy mornings to come. The broken Omega and the cursed Alpha were gone, replaced by a Luna with a voice of iron and an Alpha who had learned that the greatest strength was not in solitude, but in a bond powerful enough to shatter fate. We were not two halves of a whole, but a kingdom of two, built on the ruins of a prophecy, destined to rule over a land finally at peace. And in the quiet of the falling snow, I knew our story was not an ending, but the beginning of a new legend. One not of curses and shadows, but of sacrifice, and of a love that had healed a mountain.